Karoline Leavitt had always been known for her punctuality and precision. As the press secretary of the White House under President Donald Trump, her days were meticulously planned, her every move calculated, but this day was different. It was meant to be an ordinary afternoon, a quick briefing with the communications team, followed by a meeting to prepare for the president's upcoming address. But fate had other plans. Just as she was about to head to the briefing room, her phone buzzed with a message from the Chief of Staff. Urgent, pick up classified documents from Secret Service. No details to be shared. Karoline raised an eyebrow. It was unusual for her to be sent on such errands. But the urgency in the message left no room for questions. After notifying her assistant, she made her way to the restricted wing of the White House, where a Secret Service agent escorted her to an unmarked car. The drive was silent, the agent's expression stoic. Karoline's mind raced. Classified documents? Why was she the one to retrieve them? And why the secrecy? The car pulled up to an inconspicuous building just outside of Washington, D.C. It was drab and unassuming, almost like an abandoned warehouse. But a heavily armed guards and biometric security systems told a different story. This was the nerve center of the Secret Service. Once inside, she was led through a series of metal detectors and did checks. The corridors were cold and sterile, illuminated by harsh fluorescent lights. As she approached a reinforced steel door labeled top clearance only, her escort stopped. "This is where I leave you, ma'am," he said flatly before walking away. The door slid open with a hiss, and she stepped inside. The room was vast, filled with rows of high-tech surveillance equipment and computer terminals manned by agents who barely acknowledged her presence. At the far end of the room stood another door, this one labeled Archives Restricted Access. Karoline's heart pounded as she approached it. She swiped her clearance card, and the door unlocked with a soft click. As she stepped through, she expected to see a typical records room, stacks of files, cabinets, and maybe a few safes. But what she found was beyond anything she could have imagined. The room was lined with floor-to-ceiling screens, each displaying live feeds from locations around the world. She recognized some of the place's international embassies, key government buildings, even private residences. But one screen caught her eye, and her blood ran cold. It was the Oval Office, and President Trump was in a heated discussion with several top advisors. She could hear every word. "If this gets out, it could destroy everything," one advisor warned. "We have to contain it." Trump's voice was firm, almost unyielding. "No leaks, no mistakes. Do whatever it takes." Karoline's mind raced. What was this about? And why was the Secret Service monitoring the Oval Office? Before she could process it, a voice behind her shattered the silence. "You weren't supposed to see this." She spun around to find a man dressed in a sleek black suit, his face expressionless. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice shaking. He took a step closer, his eyes cold and calculating. "I'm the one who decides who leaves this room. And right now, you're not on that list." Karoline's heart raced as she faced the man in black. His presence was unnerving, his stance predatory. She tried to steady her voice, masking the fear that threatened to consume her. "I was sent here by the Chief of Staff. I'm here to pick up classified documents," she stated firmly, trying to reclaim her authority. The man's lips curled into a faint smile, void of any warmth. "Classified? Indeed. But not the kind you were meant to find." He stepped closer, his eyes never leaving hers. "You wandered too far, Miss Leavitt." Her instincts kicked in, and she took a step back, her fingers brushing against her phone in her pocket. But before she could even think of calling for help, the man's voice cut through the air. "There's no signal here. This room is off the grid." Karoline's mind raced. How could she have been so naive? She was in the heart of the Secret Service's nerve center, a place designed to be impenetrable. She was trapped. Swallowing her fear, she decided to confront him. "Why are you spying on the president?" she demanded, her voice firmer this time. "Does he know about this?" The man's expression didn't change, but his eyes darkened. "Need to know basis. And he doesn't need to know." His tone was cold, calculated. "This isn't about loyalty, Miss Leavitt. It's about control. Information is power. And the power to control information is what keeps the world from falling apart." She was stunned. "You're monitoring everyone, aren't you? Not just the president, his advisors, foreign leaders, heirs, even me." Her voice wavered as the reality sank in. The man didn't deny it. "Welcome to the real White House, Miss Leavitt. The one that exists behind the curtains, pulling the strings, every conversation, every decision, every secret. We see it all." Karoline's stomach churned. This was bigger than anything she could have imagined. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. He took another step closer, his face just inches from hers. "I am the gatekeeper, and you just walked into my domain." Before she could respond, the door behind her slammed shut, the lock clicking into place. Her pulse quickened as she realized she was truly trapped. "You can't do this. People will notice I'm missing," she shouted, her voice echoing off the cold metal walls. The man simply shrugged. "They'll be informed that you've been detained for security clearance issues. Standard protocol. No one will question it." His calmness sent chills down her spine. Desperation took over, and she bolted toward the door, her fists pounding against the unyielding metal. "Let me out," she screamed, her voice cracking. But the man just watched, his expression devoid of emotion. "It's not personal, Miss Leavitt. It's just protocol." With that, he turned and walked out through another door, leaving her alone in the surveillance chamber. The screens continued to flicker, the live feeds showing scenes from around the world. But all Karoline could see was the feed of the Oval Office, where President Trump continued his conversation, oblivious to the fact that every word was being recorded. Panic surged through her. She had to get out. She had to warn him. But how? The room was impenetrable, and the man had made it clear that she wasn't leaving. Then she saw a small vent near the ceiling, just big enough for her to squeeze through. Hope flickered in her chest. It was risky, but it was her only chance. She grabbed a chair and climbed up, prying at the metal grate. It was secured tightly, but adrenaline gave her the strength to rip it off. She glanced back at the screens one last time, her mind reeling with the implications of what she had discovered. Then, with a deep breath, she hoisted herself into the vent, crawling into the darkness. But as she moved forward, she heard the faint echo of the man's voice through the ventilation shafts. "We have a runner. Lockdown initiated." The entire building shuddered as the alarms blared to life, the red lights flashing ominously. Karoline's blood ran cold. They were coming for her. The metal ventilation shaft was narrow and cold, the sharp edges scraping against Karoline's elbows and knees as she crawled forward. The echo of alarms reverberated through the ducts, a constant reminder that her time was running out. Her breaths were shallow, her heart pounding so loudly she feared it would give her away. She had no idea where the vent led, but any place was better than the surveillance chamber. The man's words haunted her. "I am the gatekeeper." What kind of power did he wield? And how far would he go to protect the secrets she had uncovered? Karoline paused at an intersection in the vents, her eyes adjusting to the dim light seeping through the slats. Peering through the grate below her, she saw a hallway swarming with agents, their movements swift and coordinated. They were securing the exits, ensuring that no one could leave the building. She held her breath as two agents stopped directly beneath her. "She's a high-priority target," one of them muttered. "Orders are to contain her at all costs. No exceptions." High-priority target? Karoline's chest tightened. She was no longer just the press secretary. She was a threat liability that needed to be eliminated. The agents moved on, and she continued crawling, careful to make as little noise as possible. The metal was cold against her palms, her body aching from the cramped position. But she pushed forward, driven by sheer survival instinct. After what felt like an eternity, she reached another grate. This one overlooked a storage room, cluttered with boxes and equipment. It appeared to be empty, and she seized the opportunity. She kicked at the grate until it gave way, tumbling to the floor below. Karoline dropped down, her legs buckling beneath her from the impact. Pain shot up her knees, but she bit back a cry, her eyes darting around the room. She needed a disguise, something to help her blend in. Her eyes landed on a row of maintenance uniforms hanging on the wall. Without hesitation, she grabbed one and slipped it over her clothes, tucking her hair under the cap. She caught a glimpse of herself in a dusty mirror. Ranger stared back. A burst of static crackled through the intercom. "Sector C is clear. Begin sweep of Sector D." She can't have gone far. Panic surged through her veins. They were closing in. She crept to the door, her ear pressed against it as she listened for footsteps. The hallway was momentarily silent. Taking a deep breath, she eased the door open and slipped out. The corridors were a labyrinth, each turn identical to the last. But she followed the exit signs, her instincts guiding her as she moved swiftly yet cautiously. The disguise work agents passed by without giving her a second glance. But just as she rounded a corner, she nearly collided with the man in black. He was speaking into a communicator, his voice cold and methodical. "Initiate lockdown on all exterior doors. She won't get out of here." Karoline's heart leapt into her throat. She turned on her heel, retracing her steps as quietly as possible. But she knew she was running out of time. If the exits were sealed, she would be trapped. Her mind raced. There had to be another way out. Then she remembered the loading bay, a service entrance that wasn't part of the main security system. She had seen it on her way in. If she could reach it before they locked down the building, she might have a chance. She picked up her pace, weaving through the hallways, her eyes constantly scanning for agents. But just as she reached the final turn, an alarm blared, followed by a mechanical voice. "Lockdown initiated. All exits secured." "No, no, no," she whispered, panic threatening to consume her. She reached the loading bay door and yanked on the handle. But it wouldn't budge. It was electronically sealed. Desperation took over, and she pounded on the door, her fists bruising against the metal. "Help! Somebody please!" But her cries were swallowed by the blaring sirens. She sank to her knees, her back pressed against the cold metal door. Was this how it ended, trapped in a maze of secrets? Silence before she could expose the truth? But just as hopelessness began to take hold, she heard a faint buzzing sound. Her head snapped up, her eyes locking on a keypad beside the door. It was blinking, the digital screen flashing an error message. A spark of hope ignited. If she could override the system, she might be able to force the door open. But she had no idea how. Her fingers danced over the keypad, her mind racing. What was the code? Then she remembered something the chief of staff had once said in passing: all emergency overrides use the same universal code. For security reasons. Could it be that simple? Her hands trembled as she typed in the number 7119. The year the Secret Service was founded. The keypad beeped, and the screen flickered before displaying the word "unlocked." The door hissed as the lock disengaged. And Karoline didn't waste a second. She shoved it open and burst into the loading bay. the cold night air hitting her like a wave. Freedom was just a few steps away. But as she sprinted toward the exit, a figure stepped into her path, blocking her escape. The man in black. His face was shadowed, but his voice was unmistakable. "You really thought you could outrun me?" Karoline skidded to a halt, her chest heaving, eyes wide with fear. There was nowhere left to run. Karoline's mind spun as she faced the man in black, the cold night air slicing through the loading bay. His silhouette was menacing, his posture unwavering. He was like a phantom, always one step ahead. There was no escape. She took a step back, her back pressing against the cold metal door. Her hands trembled, her body aching from the frantic crawl through the vents. But she forced herself to stand tall, her voice sharp. "Why are you doing this? Who are you working for?" The man's lips twisted into a cruel smile. "You still don't get it, do you? I don't work for anyone. I am the authority here." He took a deliberate step toward her, his voice cold and detached. "My job is to protect the stability of this nation, and that means controlling the narrative." Karoline's stomach churned. By spying on the president? On his advisors? On the entire world? Her voice cracked with disbelief. "You're violating every principle this country was built on." His expression didn't waver. "Principles don't keep the world safe. Information does." He folded his arms, his gaze piercing. "We see everything. We know everything. That's how we maintain control. That's how we prevent chaos." Karoline shook her head, her anger flaring. "You're not protecting anyone. You're manipulating the truth. You're playing God." He took another step closer, his eyes cold as steel. "You're naive, Miss Leavitt. The world isn't as black and white as your press briefings. People need to feel safe, even if it means feeding them lies." Her heart pounded as the weight of his words sank in. "You've been doing this for years, haven't you? Controlling the narrative. Silencing anyone who gets too close." Her eyes narrowed. "Even the president doesn't know, does he?" The man's face darkened, his voice lowering. "He knows what he needs to know. Nothing more, nothing less. It's better that way." Karoline's fists clenched, her anger overpowering her fear. "You're a monster." He laughed, a hollow, mirthless sound. "Call me what you want, but monsters keep the world spinning." He reached into his jacket, pulling out a small device that blinked ominously. "And unfortunately for you, you've seen too much." Her blood ran cold as she realized what he meant. "You're going to kill me." It wasn't a question. His face was devoid of emotion. "It's not personal. It's just protocol." He pressed a button on the device, and the room was flooded with red lights. An automated voice echoed through the loading bay. "Security breach detected. Initiate containment procedure." The door slammed shut, metal barriers sliding into place. Karoline's heart raced as the walls began to close in, the room growing smaller. She was being trapped, contained like an insect in a jar. Panic surged through her. She lunged at the man, her fist swinging wildly. But he moved with inhuman speed, dodging her blows effortlessly. He caught her wrist, twisting it behind her back and pinning her against the wall. His voice was low, menacing. "You should have stayed in your lane, Miss Leavitt." He tightened his grip, his face inches from hers. "You were just another pawn. But you became a threat, and threats are neutralized." Karoline struggled, pain shooting through her arm. But she refused to give up. She twisted her body, using the momentum to break free. She stumbled forward, her eyes locking on the control panel beside the exit. It was her only chance. She sprinted toward it, her fingers flying over the buttons. The man's footsteps were right behind her, his movements swift and calculated. But she was faster. Desperation fueled her as she entered the override code 7119. The barriers shuddered, the locks clicking open. The exit was unsealed. She turned just in time to see the man lunging at her. His face twisted in rage. She ducked, his body slamming into the wall behind her. Without looking back, she threw open the door and ran into the night. The cold air hit her face, the darkness enveloping her as she sprinted across the parking lot. Her lungs burned, her legs screaming in protest. But she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. She could hear his voice echoing behind her, his shouts growing fainter as she put distance between them. But she knew he wouldn't give up. He would hunt her down, no matter where she went. Karoline's mind raced as she reached the perimeter fence. She climbed it, the metal cutting into her hands. But she didn't feel the pain. All she could think about was getting away, escaping the nightmare she had stumbled into. She dropped to the other side, her body hitting the ground hard. But she scrambled to her feet, her eyes searching for a way out. A road stretched out before her, empty and desolate. She ran toward it, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. She had to expose the truth. She had to warn the president. But most of all, she had to survive. The night swallowed her as she disappeared into the darkness, the sound of sirens echoing in the distance. She was free for now, but she knew the hunt had only just begun. Karoline ran until her legs gave out, her body collapsing against a tree on the side of the desolate road. Her chest heaved, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she fought to steady herself. Every muscle screamed in protest. But she knew she couldn't stop for long. They were still looking for her. Her mind spun with the revelations she had uncovered. The surveillance room, the man in black, the web of lies woven around the Oval Office. It was all too much to process. But one thing was clear: she couldn't go back to the White House. Not until she exposed the truth. She pulled out her phone, her fingers trembling as she dialed the only number she could trust. It rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "Karoline, where are you? Everyone's looking for you." It was Sarah, her closest confidant on the communications team. Karoline's voice wavered as she spoke. "Sarah, listen to me. I need you to do exactly as I say. No questions. Can you do that?" There was a pause before Sarah's voice softened. "Of course. What's going on?" Karoline took a deep breath. "I need you to send a message to the president. Directly to him. No aides, no secretaries. It has to be private." She hesitated, her throat tightening. "Tell him Tell him they're watching him. That he can't trust anyone. Not even the Secret Service." Silence filled the line, and Karoline could feel Sarah's shock. "Karoline, what are you saying? That's treason." "I know," Karoline whispered, her voice breaking. "But it's the truth. They're spying on him. On all of us. They're controlling everything. And they'll do anything to keep it that way." Her eyes scanned the dark road, half expecting to see headlights approaching. "Please, Sarah, he needs to know." There was another pause before Sarah's voice hardened with determination. "All right, I'll get the message to him. But what about you? Where are you?" Karoline's chest tightened. "I can't tell you. It's safer that way." She swallowed the lump in her throat. Just be careful. They'll come after you if they find out you helped me." Sarah's voice was firm. "I'm not afraid of them. Just promise me you'll stay safe." Karoline's eyes burned with tears she refused to shed. "I promise." She hung up, her fingers trembling as she slipped the phone back into her pocket. The night was eerily silent, the cold air biting at her skin. She looked around, her eyes adjusting to the darkness. She needed to keep moving. If the man in black was as powerful as he claimed, he would have every resource at his disposal to track her down. She stumbled down the road, her body aching with exhaustion. But she forced herself to keep going, her mind replaying everything she had seen in that surveillance room. The live feeds, the recordings, the conversations in. Then it hit her: the feeds were stored somewhere. If she could find the source, she could get the evidence she needed. She could prove everything. Hope flickered in her chest, fueling her tired limbs. She needed to get to a safe location. Somewhere she could regroup and plan her next move. But first, she needed a way to travel unnoticed. She spotted a gas station in the distance, its flickering neon sign casting an eerie glow over the deserted parking lot. She approached cautiously, her eyes scanning for any sign of agents. The place was empty save for an old pickup truck near the side. The keys were still in the ignition. The driver nowhere to be found. Karoline's heart raced. It was risky, but she didn't have a choice. She slid into the driver's seat, her hands trembling as she turned the key. The engine roared to life, and she pulled out of the parking lot, the truck rattling as she sped down the road. She didn't know where she was going, but she knew she couldn't stop. Not yet. Her mind raced with the possibilities. Who was behind the surveillance operation? How deep did the conspiracy go? And who could she trust? The man in black's words echoed in her mind: "I am the gatekeeper." But gatekeeper to what? And why was he willing to kill to protect it? She gripped the steering wheel. Her jaw clenched. She would find out. She would expose the truth, no matter the cost. As the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, Karoline's phone buzzed with a new message. She glanced at the screen, her heart stopping as she read the words: "He knows. They're coming for you. Run." Her blood ran cold as she looked in the rearview mirror, her eyes widening in horror. A fleet of black SUVs was speeding toward her, their headlights flashing ominously. Her hands tightened on the steering wheel, her foot slamming down on the accelerator. The engine roared as the truck surged forward, the tires screeching against the pavement. The chase had begun. She was no longer just the press secretary. She was the hunted, and the truth she carried was worth killing for. But Karoline Leavitt was not going down without a fight. The sun rose over the horizon, its golden light illuminating the road ahead. She wouldn't stop. She wouldn't surrender. Not until the world knew the truth. The reckoning was just beginning.